Well, welcome. On behalf of Dr. Bauserman and I, thank you guys for taking the time out to learn in our extended series on building an MTSS framework. We are excited that you're here. We also want to note that it is Friday the 13th, so there's no telling what's going to happen in the next hour, especially when you get Dr. Bauserman and I together. So hopefully we can deliver something for you guys. Hopefully it's something that's meaningful, that will help you guys support your MTSS structure and all the things that you guys are trying to do. And I know, like I said, it's a stressful time. We've got the holidays around the corner. I'm sure a lot of people probably won't be traveling for obvious reasons, but hopefully there's something productive that we can do today and so on. We'll ask a couple of questions. We're really going to focus in on the interventions and implementation. And more specifically, this third session is really going to be talking about evidence-based interventions, that continuum that we recommend, as well as understanding what it is to have systemic implementation and how to actually, create that. And then, of course, we'll end with progress monitoring. All those things that are going to be required under an MTSS umbrella to really make sure that all of your interventions have strong efficacy, that have really, really strong outcomes for teachers or for students, obviously. So like I said, and then again, just a reminder that we'll be doing an evaluation at the end of the year about how we put all this together and so on and so forth, okay? But before we do, what Dr. Bauserman and I would like to do, before we do that, Dr. Bauserman, you just want to say hello?
Yes, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Friday the 13th. As Doug said, hopefully we'll survive the hour, and I think we're going to get a lot of good stuff out of this session, so I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, sir. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a poll, and our first poll is going to be launched. So obviously just answer at your convenience, and then we'll process as soon as it's over. Sherry, did you post that poll?
Yes, but it doesn't. There we go.
Okay.
It just populated.
Bingo. Thank you. Yep, looks like they're coming in good. We're just seeing some, looks like a lot of people are choosing the all of the above, which is really impressive. Looks like we got a couple of groups look like that they're struggling with the implementation, which is what Dr. Bauserman and I see a lot of. A lot of times people put the things in place, but we're not really sure if they're implementing with fidelity and consistency. So that's always a big chunk. Cool. All right. Dr. Bauserman, anything about the results? You surprised?
No, not surprised. I know that probably within all the above, there may be one of those three areas they struggle with a little bit more than others, but that's usually what we hear when we talk with districts across the country.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you guys for doing that. Like I said, we know and understand the importance of putting together an MTSS framework and a structure. Obviously, what we want to do is really add to that, see if you guys do have any kind of gaps. Sometimes it's good just to confirm what you guys think you'll be doing and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about that. And really, Dr. Bauserman and I are really, really advocates of equitable practice. And we're going to talk more about that as we go on. But it's this idea that, we have all these interventions and all these strategies and all these best practice and quality research-based, suggestions. And a lot of times people get really confused because it gets convoluted and the fact of how do we implement all this stuff. And a lot of times what happens is schools and districts will just throw everything at the students and hope, something works and so on. So what we want to do is to figure out how do we become more strategic in our support. And especially is if we can be more strategic about that targeted need. We've been saying that for the last 2 sessions. So we're hopefully today, we're going to talk about how do we get there? What do we need to do? What are the action steps to say, how can we become more strategic? And how do we say that under our MTSS framework is that we are drivers of equitable practice instead of saying, well, we're just going to, provide, these a variety of things unnecessarily to kids that really don't need them. What's interesting is it's kind of like what I think has come out of COVID-19 is this idea that some of our kids now that have been in classrooms have really shown that they can learn a lot by being self-independent. Teachers have had been forced to sometimes say, and we call it differentiated instruction, but again, it's breaking apart DI in the sense of not all of our kids need direct instruction. They don't need a teacher face-to-face and so on and so forth. And I think COVID has kind of exposed that they're kids that really can be very independent in their learning and really be self-supportive. So, but there's also always going to be kids who need a more direct approach and so on. So that's the part we want to focus on is how do we make sure that we're doing that and taking advantage of the fact that it's kind of like UDL, Universal Design for Learning. It's a great complement for differentiated instruction. When you talk about how to deliver it, if we're talking about content, process, and product in DI, how do we support that? Well, not everybody needs to tap into the Universal Design for Learning kinds of things. Some kids need the videos. Some kids need more than that. So again, how do we target that support with what we call our layers? And that's really what we're going to be talking about more in depth as we go through. So this is our framework. So again, we want to make sure that we are hitting. Dr. Bauserman, anything more on equity?
No, I think I think you really summed it up. It's just we did find through COVID, even through our own children's experiences, that they don't need everything everybody else needs, or they may need something more than everybody else, and that really kind of did shine a light on this equitable approach.
I agree. Yeah, I've noticed that big time. So. As far as the framework, I think, again, we have this is kind of our working framework, which allows us to say, okay, what parts of this are we struggling with? What parts do we do really well? And so we took the time to say, okay, as we start to layer, our different kinds of response to interventions, our tiers, whether it's an academic tier, behavioral tier, social emotional tier. Remember last time we talked about how to identify those needs. We went into the identification, the analysis. Now we're moving over to those tier levels of interventions. And now we're matching. Our job now is to figure out how do we match? How do we strategically align those interventions with those needs? And how do we know what we currently do is really making sense and so on? And that's, again, where we bring in the equity, that equitable practice. And then, of course, how do we monitor to make sure that those interventions that we did choose, and we're hopefully they're evidence-based, research-based, is how do we know that students are making that progress? So again, making sure we're doing that analysis, we're going to talk about that as well. But again, wanted to show where we are at within this framework and so on and so forth. Okay. So the mainstay is going to be this part of the framework. It's really just taking the time. None of this is new. With education, every once in a while somebody comes in and calls it something different and so on. But in essence, it's really identifying the tier levels, whether it's academic, behavior, social, emotional. So what we're going to try to do is say, if whatever tier we're talking about, RTI tier, is what interventions do we have, and are they evidence-based? Do we have this continuum? Do our program people, our interventionists, our teachers, all of our people that are intervening, do they have a continuum, this array of evidence-based strategies for all three? And then are we able to progress monitor so that we can check the implementation, especially when we're checking for fidelity and consistency. So we know that if we're going to really truly do this and deliver this in a systemic way, and that's the key. I think a lot of the really master schools, the really highly effective schools, are just peppered with systemic processes throughout. Whether you're talking about someone walking into the door for the first time, a parent walks in, it's a systemic way of how to greet people. We want to be able to do that with every intervention we have on the campus or throughout the district. And we do that by following this framework and by including the types of tools that we want to and so on. Dr. Bauserman?
Yeah, I think this slide right here is really kind of setting up where we're headed and just giving a good visual of what do you have in place, how have you determined that that's been put in place, and then how are you going to implement it, which we noticed from the poll is one of the more difficult tasks, is putting these things into play. So yeah. This is really going to kind of guide us today.
Okay. So the first level for the first work is this. So this is kind of our overall, when somebody comes to Dr. Bauserman and I, we're doing some consulting, they'll say, okay, Doug, how do we make it systemic? And I say, well, then we first got to realize is what are you guys doing? Do you have a systematic way to deliver your interventions? And obviously that goes back to last session. Do we have a systematic way of identifying those needs? So being able to deliver systematically will generate a systemic kind of intervention and framework. That's how we have to be able to deliver it. Now, in order to do that systematic delivery, we're going to use this 4 core, which we call preventative, proactive, interactive, and reactive. And the idea is what kinds of actions do we put in play on the continuum? So from the very general universal, which everybody kind of understands, the universal tier 1, from that preventative all the way to the reactive. And again, it's not underestimating the reactive kind of stage, even though it comes in the form of sometimes consequence. Dr. Bauserman and I know that we work with students with emotional disturbance in our day, and then we eventually work with general ed and so on. But the interesting part is that whole cycle is what's necessary in order to really make sure that the student at every level, even at the reactive stage, it's the idea that I'm bringing kids in, I'm giving them some kind of consequence. We'll talk a little bit more about that and really what that means. So there's a process for that, and that drives our equitable practice, which we're going to use, which we call what's the DIF, the DIF, the duration, intensity, and frequency of not only the need, but of the intervention. So Dr. Bauserman and I are going to show you guys, again, how do we use, if we're going to do systematic delivery, let's use the 4 core that drives our equitable practice. And how are we going to do that? We're going to ask ourselves, what's the DIF? So we're going to actually go through that process to talk about what we would recommend at your school or district or so on to actually get you to that level. Okay? Anything, Dr. Bauserman?
No, I'm good on that one. Just always keep what's the diff.
Yeah.
Always be thinking what's the diff.
All right, so let's break down the 4 core. So the idea of this is that if we're trying to create systemic interventions, and we really want to make sure that those tiers are really rich and impactful, we're going to start with obviously the prevention strategies first, and that looks like, again, for people to say is, Doug, obviously people on the call, you guys are obviously privy to what's recommended out there. But these are the things that we start with and saying, well, if it's academic, what kind of curriculum do we have? Is it 21st century skills? Is it higher order thinking? Is it college readiness? That whole stream of the literature recommends to say that's what should be driving our curriculum. Now, of course, if you're at a state level, The state's going to recommend a curriculum. They're going to put in those minimum standards, and then the district's going to create their own curriculum. But again, as they start to do this, and that's you guys, is how are we aligned with those 21st century skills and how are we thinking it? And on the flip side is, if we're talking about academic, is what kind of effective pedagogy are we promoting in our communities? Obviously, we know the research on the effect that a quality effective teacher has on student achievement. But we know throughout the literature, it's extremely high. So we know that we've got to have quality teachers. So again, the preventative academically is going to say, a strong curriculum, an engaging curriculum with a highly qualified teacher. That's obviously step one. And social emotional, we know, again, what drives that tier level is going to be that curriculum. And again, I think it's what I have seen schools that have been successful at this with the MTSS is the ones that integrate this curriculum as a manifestation of student actions throughout the day. And the examples is social emotional learning curriculum might advocate for self-awareness or self-management. Well, what's happened sometimes, 20 years ago, generalized social skills was about the idea that we're just going to teach kids to be nice, say thank you, how to be, self-aware, but we weren't specific about how that's manifested in the classroom. So taking the curriculum about social awareness, self-awareness, and self-management is building cool downs in the classroom. Timeout has a negative connotation. Cool down should have a positive connotation. So the cool down is we're going to put that in play so that students can actually practice what it is to be self-managed, practice what it is to bring themselves down. And that's what we found to be lacking 20 years ago is we had these awesome lessons, but we didn't take the time to integrate those. So I think for social emotional competency at that preventative level, it's not just the curriculum, but it's how that curriculum is manifested in student behavior. And the last one is behavioral expectations. Obviously, behavior is a manifestation of communication. It's a manifestation of emotion. But what we have found is the preventive strategy for behavior is high expectations and relationships. We know the literature says that teachers that have lower expectations, and these are for kids on the margins, whether it's students at risk, students of color, students of special ed, students that are transgender, students of a certain sexual preference, it doesn't matter. We have found through the data that the marginalized kids tend to be pushed away. And what we've also found is that they have lower expectations. We know that doesn't work. So again, high expectations for our kids and the relationships that our teachers, that working relationships, not friends, but that working relationships. So that's really at the core. Obviously, these are things that you guys have heard of, but again, it's trying to take that and put it in place so you guys can actually see how it's manifested. Telling teachers in a workshop that relationships matter is very different than telling teachers, we want you guys to have at least one 5-minute conference every week with every one of your kids. And then finding out if it's 5 minutes isn't manageable, then what is manageable? So how are our teachers connecting with our kids? We're going to build that in and show people how it's manifested, whether through our teachers or through our students. Adam, anything about that before I go into proactive, interactive, reactive?
I think a lot of places have this in theory. Yeah. And what I mean by that is they have the curriculums. They have, in all three of the categories, they have those. It's just, what are they doing with them? And I think it goes back to the top one, which is quality teaching. I've said it for years. You could have the greatest curriculum in the world, or what's known as the greatest curriculum in the world. If you don't have the right people to implement it, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, I have my workout bench, my treadmill, step one, buy it, and then it's that, I know what works, if I, do more, run more. And so, but it's hard to put those things into practice. And like you said, it's trying to get everyone to buy into that and so on, which creates your multi-tier system. That's going to determine whether it's a success or it isn't. So, and then what we want to do is, obviously, as the stronger our preventative is, obviously we want to be, when we talk about part of the 4 core, is that proactive. So it's teaching teachers is that what we want to be able to do is say, we are the extension of what we're advocating for. So, for example, is I always ask teachers is, why are you at the door? Why are you in the hallway? Why are you walking around the room? And what we want teachers to be able to say is, we're doing that as a proactive measure to promote the positive. We're not in the hallway to catch kids being bad. We're not at the door to catch kids doing the wrong thing. We're not walking around the room to try to catch kids talking and off task. We're doing that as a proactive measure to promote what we have established in our curriculum, our social emotional curriculum, and our behavioral curriculum. So those are the things that we want to be able to do, and especially if you're talking about being proactive in whether you're talking about asking really good questions, if you're talking about academic, asking really strategic and higher order thinking questions is a wonderful proactive strategy for academics. And so again, do teachers understand what it is to be proactive? And we're going to talk more about the specific strategies and how they kind of all fall into that. But it's again, the proactive is we're stepping, we're trying to anticipate what kids might happen, and we're just going to be there to do those things. And then we talk about the interactive. So sometimes I'm at the door, I'm walking around the room, and I start to see kids getting off task or struggling with their work or so on. And that's where, again, I start to go to that second level of the 4 core. We talk about redirecting or reminders, proximity, and a verbal cue, maybe even a nonverbal cue, a quick conference. Those are the things that we're interacting with kids with under the guise of this. One question you can ask, if you're a person that teaches teachers, PD and that kind of stuff, ask your teachers, what is the purpose of student and teacher interactions? And some of my newer teachers and struggling teachers, they struggle answering that question. And what I love to tag is this, I tag it as an opportunity. I always saw these interactions as opportunities to develop a relationship, to promote the positive, to listen, to hear what some of the kids are struggling with, versus I want to do these interactions to make sure kids are on task, to make sure they're not talking, to make sure they're not disrupting. You see the different philosophies. So again, in order to really, truly, really develop a systemic kind of behavioral expectation, social emotional, we've got to make sure that our teachers are implementing that at that core level. That's what's going to create and permeate throughout the culture and so on. And then the last one is that reactive, is that responding. So again, that 4 core is what are we doing? And I love this, Dr. Bauserman and I have been in a lot of situations where we had to deal with consequences. And we know that the tough kids, even kids who don't get in trouble a lot, it's mostly not the consequence. What it is for the tough ones, what I always say is we have to have consequences because of accountability. My kids always knew that when they earned something, they earned a positive or they earned a negative, they were being held accountable. They might not change their behavior just because of that consequence, but they knew that you're going to be accountable. So that's what Dr. Bauserman tried to do at the school level, is to say, try to interpret the consequences as an accountability measure, because what we want to be able to do is that's where you can build your relationships. It is the best, most intense time to build relationships during this reactive consequence time. It's the ability to tell Johnny, Susie, Juan, Demetrius, whoever, that we're going to work through this. It's why restorative circles has been so popular, because it shifts this punitive, this debriefing of consequence into a more proactive, let's talk through it. So those kinds of principles have really helped at this stage. So again, do you guys have that at the tier level on how you're responding to students, whether it be, like I said, social, emotional, or behavioral? Dr. Bauserman?
Yeah, I would also remind folks that consequences can be positive. So
Yes.
You can be moving through this, and the reactive approach, your response is a positive one. As you've gone through, you have your preventative, you've done your proactive work, you've even done some interactions, and then you respond in a positive way. That's a huge one. And the second piece is, Dr. Maraffa and I work with a lot of teachers that may have been struggling or having difficulty. And when we ask that question, what do you do when this happens, or what are you doing? They don't use an interactive approach. They skip that one and go right to the reactive. They don't intervene in between. And so I think that's kind of a big one. You don't want to miss that interactive, because that could be the time where you don't even have to be reactive unless it's a positive reaction.
Yeah. Yep. So let's look at, as we develop this 4 core, what we want to do is we have found this exercise to be really, really beneficial. We recommend with schools that we work with is, let's go ahead and list the interventions that you have in play and the strategies. Because obviously, if you're trying to create a multi-tier system of support, we should have an array of evidence-based strategies that everyone has access to. And so again, thinking about the 4 core, we like to say, let's list all those strategies. And then what we ask them to do is, let's code them. Let's code them as a 4 core to really get a sense, an analysis of where we feel like our current interventions and strategies fall. Do they fall more in the preventative? Do they fall in that we're probably being more reactive? Do we fall in the fact that, a lot of our teachers are interactive, we're not doing a lot of proactive, and so on and so forth? And then the evaluation of interventions, that's going to come in the form of progress monitoring. So again, we thought we would just do this exercise and go through it with you and just kind of say how we do it, in hopes that, again, it's something you can add to your multi-tier systems. Because again, we want to be able to say we have a continuum, but we also want to say that we have a continuum that relies heavily on the preventative and the proactive versus the reactive. And so again, and then we'll talk about progress monitoring. So the first thing we do is this: we list out these, and these are just interventions that Dr. Bauserman and I just listed. Whether it's an intervention or a strategy, that's how we list it. These are things that you guys have seen, and so on and so forth. But again, it's really important, whether it's a staff meeting, whether it's a program meeting, is to say, look, we really need to provide this exhaustive list of what we think teachers have access to at the school, whether it's academic, behavioral, or social emotional. What do you have access to? Let's look at your toolbox. The master teachers on campus, their lists are going to be a lot longer. Those highly effective teachers, they're going to be able to just list. The new teachers and struggling teachers have a very small list. But again, what we want to be able to say is, no, we have purchased academic curriculums. We have purchased academic interventionists. We have purchased behavioral curriculum, social emotional. We have purchased programs that come in and say, this is what we're going to buy and purchase. So all those things, what happens is, but a lot of times, I'll go to a school and say, what are you guys doing? Oh, well, we're doing second steps. I'll say, okay, how is second steps manifested in the classroom? Doug, we're doing champs. Okay, well, how is champs manifested in the classroom? What about love and logic? Okay, well, tell me how is that worked? Doug, we do 21st century skills. Okay, so how's that manifested in the classroom? So again, list, and then what we do is we take it to the next step, and then we code them. So here's what we did. We said, you know what? We're going to code setting high expectations as a preventative measure. We're going to setting limits. And the reason why Dr. Bauserman and I did the different colors is because you can use interventions and strategies in very different ways. And a lot of times you can use them in a proactive, in an interactive way, rather than it being a negative. Setting limits prior to, it's kind of like when somebody goes on a bus and they're setting the expectations. but they're also setting the limit. Is this, when you do this, this is what's going to happen. That can be a very proactive, interactive thing to do. It can also be a negative. This is what you're doing. If you don't do it, this is what's going to happen. So you guys decide as we work through this. Timeout a lot of times it constitutes a negative, whereas cool down might constitute a preventative, proactive, or interactive. My students knew, and I taught this with a lot of general ed teachers, is do you have a way where kids can remove themselves from the audience, calm themselves down in a positive way, and then return back to the classroom? It's giving them a license to be removed. I've had teachers say, Mark's been sent to the office, and then we start to find out, and he said, well, he asked to go get a drink of water, and I said no. He was agitated, and you could tell Mark was just trying to remove himself, and the teacher said no, and it ended up in a very poor situation. So again, how you guys look at this or characterize it will tell you. So as you look at this list, set up classroom procedures, redirection, reminders, you figure out how you guys are using it. Are you using it as a preventative measure or a reactive measure? And then here's what you do. Once you're done with that, then you can start looking at your list. And I've done this many, many times where sometimes all we see is red. And I tell the persons that we're working with, step back, what do you notice? And of course, it's pretty easy. They're like, yeah, we got a lot of punitive, reactive kinds of things. I say, yeah, this list came from you guys, and so again, and then what we want to see is a lot of blue. We want to be inundated with lots and lots of blues. And then the second group were lots of greens, and then we've got some yellows, and then we got a few reds. So that's kind of what we want to see, and so on. So it's a great way. Number one, once you list them, it'll tell you, the kinds of strategies, interventions that you feel like your staff has access to. Number two, once you code them, then you get to realize where the efforts are mostly happening, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting exercise, and to be able to do that. Dr. Bauserman, before I move, anything on that?
Yeah, I really like the call home that has all four colors. And some people would think, how could a call home be preventative? But it's your high expectation, and it might not just be for the student. It's a high expectation of a teacher. I forced my teachers to call home for every student within the first 9 weeks with a positive. You're setting the expectation that we can call parents in a positive way.
Yeah.
Call home usually they would just code that as all red.
Yeah.
That's a bad thing.
Or
so
asking how they're using it, I mean, that's
exactly.
Yeah. How are you using that strategy or intervention,
Yeah, because I've seen timeout be coded as blue when basically they're thinking it's preventative because it's a threat. They're using it as the threat of a timeout becomes this preventative measure. No, that's not how you're supposed to use that.
No, that's some good points. Yeah, it is. And I think you guys, if you doing that exercise, is you'll start to really see how the interpretation of these things come out, and you'll start to see some of the PD focus that you need to provide. So once we've done that, then the last step is to develop this equitable practice. So what we try to do is we say, okay, you've got these tier levels of interventions. Now what happens a lot, Dr. Bauserman and I, we'll get this question a lot, is like, well, I've got my tier 1 strategies. What about my tier 2 and my tier 3? So what we try to say is, look, you can have a strategy, and you can, like conferences, I can have a conference that lasts 2 minutes, or I could have a conference on once a week that lasts 30 or 45 minutes. Whether it's academic, whether it's behavioral, social, emotional, whether I'm doing social skills, whether I'm doing, working on context clues, or whether I'm working on the fact that we're working on, behavior, it doesn't matter. So sometimes when people say it's the strategy, what we say is the diff is how intense or how long or how frequent does this behavior happen? What's the need? And then what are we going to do with the intervention? And so the intervention can change on the duration, which will change and fit the the equity of the student. The student doesn't need a 30-minute session. The student just needs a 2-minute session. The student doesn't need it every day. It just needs it once a week. And again, so working through, and like this also too, or conferences, generalized conferences, we used to talk about, students that say, hey, just talk to them. Ask them what they did last night. Don't ask them anything about school. Targeted might be, hey, I'm going to ask you what you did last night, but I'm also going to say, hey, you remember what kind of classroom goal you're working on? And individualized might be, hey, I ask them what they did last night. Hey, I ask them about what their classroom goal is, and I also ask them what their personal goal is. So again, the intensity of it can change just from that single strategy. And that's why we drive the equitable practices. These interventions, the DIF, the duration, intensity, and frequency, are going to be driven by need, which makes it equity. Dr. Bauserman?
You nailed it. And before we jump into the poll and start moving into implementation, there's a few good questions in the chat or in the Q&A that I think we can kind of address quickly here, because they did pick up on that restorative circles is black and not color-coded. So they asked, is that a reactive, or where does it fall? I think it could be reactive, but it also could be interactive. I mean, you're right in the middle of something, and we just kind of circle up and talk about it, and before it gets too far down the road.
Well, and that's the example of what do we color code it? How are we using it? And I think that's the teachable moment, is all of these don't have to be any color, but how you use them. What is obvious is when we start to, what punishment is. So the reds are very easy to see and very hard to take. How do I take a loss of privilege as anything but a negative? So those are the easy ones to code red. And sometimes we have a lot of punishment in schools and so on. But yeah, I mean, I think restorative circles is just an opportunity to say, which color is it?
There's another one about, and it's more in the academic world, but I think you might be able to address it as well, is how might the 4 core look with regard to RTI academic? So the preventative, the proactive, the interactive, and the reactive, how does that look academically? I mean, preventative, of course, is going to be the curriculum, but if you want to address the other ones as well.
It's the idea of, we are obviously, the preventative is we're doing higher order thinking, we're doing interdisciplinary, we're addressing the idea of multiple intelligence, Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence. We might bring in more this idea of being proactive, is we're going to be doing more setting up the students in a more project-based learning. So we're setting it up, we're being proactive in how we facilitate the learning, just like UDL. UDL is a great proactive strategy in the sense of, we want to be able to say, this is going to be our strategy, our methods that we're going to use to facilitate this instructional or this intellectual growth. And then the interactive is going to be played where we talk about more as a facilitator and guide. A lot of the countries that do really well on these worldly tests, it's interesting to see how they use proactive, interactive academically as a opportunity to be more facilitators, more guide, more coaches, rather than be a person that says reactive, like just come up to me and I'll help you if you're struggling. So the proactive, interactive is what we really struggle with intellectually. Is master teachers do this naturally, that they're able to switch the role of a teacher, the purveyor of knowledge, to the facilitator, to the guide, to the coach, setting up those opportunities. So that's where I would say that the proactive, interactive, that's how it's manifested. And then the reactive, a lot of times, is just, well, let's come to tutoring. That's a pretty basic thing, but sometimes how we present it and the kinds of methodology we use in the classroom in the proactive, interactive will reduce the need for that specialized tutoring and so on. Now, there are some kids that are just academically, they learn differently and they need, more time. So that's a great question.
Awesome. There's 2 more in there, but I think we can save them towards the end.
Okay. All right, so that's the echo. So then let's do the next poll before we talk about progress monitoring. We're just waiting for it to post, right?
Yeah, it looks like it's trying to populate. There it goes.
I was thinking there were a lot of users like, oh no, I see one. There we go.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not. I was really thinking that, Dr. Bauserman, I was really thinking that we were going to see a lot of A, which we're seeing right now, 33. You know, almost a third. I'm not surprised, and then a lot of the D. I'm not surprised by that either. So,
I'm liking that C is starting to climb up there, though.
Yeah. Well, that's really separate, isn't it?
Yeah. There is almost an equal distribution.
It really is, yeah. Oh, wow. Very good. Okay. Yeah, cool. It's interesting. Yeah, it's a kind of a third. So, and that's not, again, thank you guys for doing that poll. It's very helpful for everybody. It is. We have found that to be really difficult. You know, what's funny is we see a lot too. Sometimes it's like, you know what, Doug, we're just trying to do this because we just need to be held accountable, and we just need to do this to do compliance. And I truly believe that we have found that so many educators want to do more analysis, want to do more professional development, but they're just not given the time. You know, and that's the unfortunate part is so many good interventionists, so many good analysts out there, but they're just not given the time to say, you know, what's working and what's not, and so on. So again, what we want to do is really just end with progress monitoring in the sense of, you know, how can we try to do that within the confines of an educational day? So the first thing we're going to look at is really being able to look at how we look at, you know, behavior and look at how we progress monitor. And really the concept, it can be very similar. Even I think Ames Web Plus, which is an academic screener. And there are so many different screeners out there. There are so many different ways to progress monitoring. We do that pretty well with benchmarking. We do the benchmarks every 6 weeks. I know a lot of schools do. And then at the end of the year, they'll do a state accountability assessment based on those benchmarks. Obviously, the benchmarks are being able to itemize, you know, what they're doing and so forth. So again, it's our recommendation is how are we being able to determine that the strategies or the interventions that we have decided are going to work for our tier levels of students? How do we know they're going to? How do we know they're working? We've got to be able to monitor in some form. This is behavioral. This is Review 360's behavioral software, which talks about a check-in, check-out process, and then it talks about being able to track strategies and being able to track students' replacement behaviors and the target behaviors. So again, it's really just for us, in order to really kind of impact the MTSS, we've got to have a way to be able to say, and again, we see this in academic a lot, we just don't see it in the behavioral, social, emotional. A lot of people are spending a lot of money and time on building a social emotional kinds of curriculums and programming and interventions. But again, because they're spending so much time trying to develop it, some people, again, don't have the time to say, is it working? There are a lot of, it's kind of like, you know, funny is behavior contracts. I can go up to a person and say, everyone seems to do behavioral contracts. But if you look at the data, the behavioral contract does not have a strong what's the word I'm looking for, Dr. Bauserman?
Efficacy.
Thank you. We've seen that struggling at times, but yet it's sometimes the go-to. So it's interesting to see when schools say, what are our top 3 strategies? We ought to be able to, at the end of the year, say, these are our top 3 academic strategies. These academic strategies seem to work well with the majority of our kids. So how do we build on that? These are the 3 behavioral strategies that seem to have the most impact. These are the top three social emotional strategies that seem to really encourage self-management, self-awareness, and social awareness. And how do we know that? Because we did the progress monitoring in the system. And then this is just another one where we talk about strategies, being able to say, this particular strategy for Christopher was cool down. So we're able to see that cool down is a positive strategy for Christopher. So what are we going to do? We're going to use cool down for Christopher, not just this year, but next year as well. So again, if we're able to really target those academic and behavioral and social emotional strategies that work, those interventions, based on our progress monitoring, can you imagine how much more efficient it is for the teacher the following year to say, where's my starting point? My starting point is I'm going to start working with these 2 or 3 that have already proven to be highly successful. Talk about a strategy efficiency. And not only do we know it's going to be efficient and the teacher's going to have more time to teach because they're not trying to figure it out, but they're also going to be highly effective, especially if they can build on this year and year and year. Dr. Bauserman?
Yeah, I remember going into a district as a specialist, a behavior specialist, and pulling all of the, you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes, the tough kids, the behavior kids, looking at their BIPs and asking how have they done the last 5 years. And most of them said, their behavior has not improved. It's probably gotten worse. And as I read through all of these BIPs, it was the same 3 interventions and strategies on there: behavior contract, close proximity to teacher, and preferential seating. All of them had the same thing year in and year out, and they weren't making progress. That's kind of the point we're trying to drive home here. If it's not working, you might want to shift gears, and if it starts to work, at least the person that gets them next year can at least have a starting point, a leaping point, like Dr. Maraffa was saying. Is you just can't keep doing it over and over. And sometimes I think Dr. Maraffa is they just don't have any other tools in the tool bag. Right. They know that those are 3 that are big ones, and they just go for it.
Well, and that's going back to our list. So going back to our list is we're trying to progress monitor those strategies and interventions that you guys have spent a lot of time, especially if you're an interventionist, whatever the category is, hey, we're trying to promote these particular strategies. Well, what's interesting is if you want to do a systemic kind of implementation for your multi-tier systems of support, whatever your philosophy is, your ideals, your tenets to programming is, how do you identify those core interventions and strategies? What I always say, Dr. Bauserman and I work with new teachers, and one of the things we talk about as a staple is wait time. Wait time is critical for academics, behavior, and social emotional. Sometimes that wait time between asking students to do something, listening to them, having them respond is a critical pedagogy that is just essential for those teachers to use. So what you'll find is kind of like cool down. When you start to track these things, you start to say, hey, 70% of our teachers find that implementing a cool down in the classroom is really beneficial. So then you're going to start figuring out, hey, these are the ones that we use. I always tell the story. I told the story yesterday, and Dr. Bauserman, it's the one where a school asked me to come in, and it was Dunn Elementary, D-U-N-N. And it was so funny because they would call me in and say, Dr. Maraffa, can you help us with finding a behavioral program that works? We're really struggling. So I gave them, let's say, program A. They tried it and they struggled. They weren't seeing the impact, and they said, no, that doesn't work. Can you do something else? And I gave them another thing, and they struggled with that too. They saw some kinds of positives, but they really just struggled. So I finally said, look, you guys are looking for a behavioral program that's going to perfectly fit your community. And I said, guess what? There's not one out there. What you've got to do is you've got to take really, really cool pieces from all of these amazing programs that are out there, because I can find positives in just about every program that's out there. Take little facets of these programs and build it into your community. Find out what works. So as you start to do your analysis, that's what's going to populate your multi-tier systems. Is this is what works at my particular school. And so they did that. They created this book. They said, "This is how it's done." I love the title. So every new teacher, every parent that came into Dunn Elementary, they got the book that said, "This is how it's done." They talked about the core of what they do academically, behaviorally, social emotionally, and so forth. So it's things like that that I think can really be helpful when you start to develop those kind of things. But again, it's really going to matter about, can we list our interventions? Everything exhausted. Can we code them? Can we establish the system of the 4 core and talks about what's the diff? And understanding is, do our teachers understand this, that we can change our strategies and so on? And then of course, we're gonna monitor that and see if we've got any kind of efficacy, strong efficacy going. And that way we'll be able to really kind of showcase our MTSS kinds of frameworks and so on. So let me go back to this. So what we're going to do, we're going to take some questions, but just reminder that next spring, on March 17th, we're going to have a conversation about how to analyze all the things that you guys have done. Start looking at the pieces. We'll share an analytical tool. It's rudimentary in nature, but again, there's lots of different stuff out there that you can use. But Dr. Bauserman and I will talk through the evaluation of your MTSS, and then talk about, what kinds of things that we can offer or provide for you guys next year that would enhance the MTSS webinar series and so on. So, Dr. Bauserman, before we get to questions, anything before questions?
Nope, I've got the questions lined up for you, and we'll fire away. There's one about really looking at the diff and how to keep them in individual terms, but they get kind of bogged down by a schedule. So what they say is, they may have a 50-minute period, you have intervention, and this is the one you have to use. It's not individualized. So trying to kind of manage those things, I think, is what they're trying to ask when it's kind of scheduled in. So it sounds like it's an intervention class, which there are a lot of classes, resource or whatever they call those in different schools. How do I kind of look at the diffs? And I think, you probably hit on it earlier, is that's more of a targeted, but you could also work on the individual inside the targeted of that intervention class.
Well, and my pushback, because I see this a lot, is, hey, Doug, we developed this schedule of interventions based on the fact that that's our schedule we've had all the time. And that's the pushback. Is it's kind of like you've heard this term personalized learning. Is people think that personalized learning is we're going to teach each person individually, and that's not what personalized learning is. Is just because your schedule allows for 45 minutes, that doesn't mean that's what the student needs. And I think sometimes we overdo it. It's kind of like accommodations. If you see 504 accommodations, those recommendations on the page is, oh my gosh, it is just peppered with accommodation after accommodation after accommodation. And the general ed teacher looks at it and goes, are you serious? Instead of saying to Mr. Johnson or Miss Johnson, these are the 3 accommodations that are going to have the greatest impact, and explaining that to the parent, explaining that to the committee, is to say, no, is we don't need 45 minutes. We feel like we can get this through 5. But then again, it's going to be the progress monitoring that's going to give you the leverage to recommend those kinds of differences. So I get that we are, seem like we're just having to do the schedule that everyone has done. But that's the pushback for me, is try to do it differently. And I think this is a great opportunity during COVID, where so many things are in so many different directions, just to try those new things. So we're sensitive to those things that make it difficult to progress.
So this one will probably be the last one I see. We're getting up on there towards the hour, unless some other pop in. But these two probably could be lumped together. What are some of the most evidence-based behavior programs or evidence-based interventions? They're trying to build menus for their schools. So what are some of the evidence-based programs that we've seen, or, evidence-based interventions specific?
Wow. I mean, there's so many out there in the sense of that I don't know if I like to recommend them, in a sense of, because it seems like we're picking one or the other. I mean, Love and Logic, Capturing Kids' Hearts, Chance, Discipline with Dignity, any kind of restorative circles, Leader in Me. That's another fantastic one. And really anybody on the line that has a good one that you're using, please add it to the chat line. But again, I would really, really recommend that anybody on the call that it does not have a singular program that they're working with is to really try to tie into multiple different ones. The behavioral, we talked about the strategy, about wait time, about proximity, about building relationships, having high expectations, being able to listen instead of talking, being able to rephrase, being able to, calm down, all those things that I think that are relationship building types of behavioral is really what is going to be beneficial to you. But I would recommend anybody, if you want a more detailed look, is please reach out to to both of us. We love helping out and making recommendations, but I think we would get a better response just by being a little bit more methodical about what we would provide. So
right, and I also think that whichever one you choose, it's going to go back to the implementation part. Do you have the staff in the right headspace and with the right skill sets to even do what you're asking to do within the confines of the curriculum? Exactly. And is it meeting the goals and the needs you have at your schools? So that really, to me, I know we could mention a lot of them. We've seen a lot of them. It's really going to be what do you have as far as a staff? How will it really impact your students? And where are you at as far as skill sets to do that? So there's one last question I think we might be able to get in. It's they don't really have any academics that they feel confident in. Again, this one I think they could reach out to us. What are the resources list for this? Not programs, but specific interventions for academic challenges. And so I think that may be something we can take offline and work with them a little bit as well and get them connected to the right people. So
yeah, that sounds good. Well, thank you guys very much, Dr. Bauserman, and I'll let Dr. Bauserman say goodbye too, but I just want to say thank you for your time. And I know it's important, or it's critical, that you've got other things that are taking your time. So we do appreciate it. Dr. Bauserman?
Absolutely. Have a wonderful rest of Friday the 13th. We enjoyed having you here. Hopefully there's some takeaways you got from our session today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you, Dr. Bauserman, and thank you, Dr. Maraffa. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and this does conclude our webinar for today.